Hi. In this screencast, we're going to talk about invasive species, which are actually, it turns out, a major cause of extinctions on the planet. What you're looking at here is a plant called kudzu. It is a ground covering vine that was brought to North America to control erosion. And well, it got out of control. Now it just covers all kinds of places, and it's very damaging. It's called an invasive species, and there's quite a few of these, especially now that people travel all over the world so much. So, anytime humans transport an organism from its native habitat, the area where it evolved, to a new location where it's never been before, is referred to as an exotic species. So, exotic. Okay. Now, exotic species, a lot of times they can't thrive in a new environment. They're just an exotic species, but sometimes they are able to thrive in that new environment. And when that happens, they may see their numbers increase explosively, exponentially, and they can become what's known as an invasive species. And an invasive species is going to have significant impacts on the ecosystem in which it is now reproducing. So, in order for an exotic species to become an invasive species, there's a couple of things that have to be true. Okay, one is it has to have the ability to access food resources in its new environment. In other words, it's got to be able to eat what's there. All right. It's also got to be able to reproduce there. So it's got to have like nesting requirements met. So that means, and if that's true, then it will be able to rapidly reproduce. Now, the other thing is that it also needs to, and it's not here, it should be, it should also not have any natural predators in its new environment. So nothing is preying on it. So it's able to eat and grow exponentially, and nothing's eating it, nothing's holding it back. So we find is that most of these species, these exotic species that become an invasive species, there's certain commonalities. They tend to be R-selected reproductive strategists. In other words, they have lots of babies really quick, and hoping that they'll. But the thing is, they do survive. So often, R-selected species they don't, but in this case, they do because they don't have predation happening. So that lack of predators, it allows these many offspring to grow to be adults and reproduce themselves. And what happens is they are successful because they are able to outcompete in many times the organisms that have already evolved in those areas. So many exotic species come in, and that's not true. But every once in a while, one will come in where these factors are true for them, at which point they begin to grow exponentially and they become an invasive species. So when an invasive species shows up in an environment, as its numbers begin to grow, it makes some pretty significant changes in the native ecosystem. It changes both the biotic factors, but it can also change the abiotic factors too. A lot of these things will cause, they'll dig holes, they'll alter their environment somewhat, so they can cause whole scale changes to their ecosystem. Uh, Bottom line is, when one species is growing rapidly, it almost invariably means a diminishment of biodiversity, right? So species are going to go extinct. Their numbers are going to decline, even if they don't go extinct. And like the guy we're looking at here is a beautiful fish. I mean, I've seen them in Indonesia where they belong. They're called lionfish. Gorgeous, right? Those are poisonous spines they're covered. Well, guess what? Somebody didn't want to kill their pet one in the Caribbean, and so they just released it in Florida, of course. And it turns out, you know what? Even though it doesn't belong in the Mesoamerican reef system, it did just fine there. Now it is completely taking over this reef system and completely altering the biodiversity of this precious, the world's second largest barrier reef is being completely altered by this one invasive species that some idiot decided they just couldn't bring themselves to kill it, so they let it go. Another invasive species. I'm just going to give you a couple of these just to give you a sense of what there's basically about 30 really bad ones out there, but we're just going to talk about a couple of them. So the Burmese python. Okay, so this one is a native of Southeast Asia, Burma, okay, but also other parts of Southeast Asia. Uh, it got imported to, among other places, in the United States as pets. Okay, so people who like reptiles as pets, they get these things. What they find is after a while, man, these things get to be over, 7 meters long. And so people don't want them after a while. A couple meters of snake is more than enough for most people. And again, I just can't bring myself to kill this pet of mine, so I'm just going to let him go, right? Be free, little python. Well, what happened was, in a lot of places where this happens, they just die, or they exist, but they're not able to reproduce exponentially. But in the Everglades Wetland National Park of South Florida, which is a very, very precious wetland environment, these things have become invasive, and they're eating everything there. They're out competing everything there, and they're reproducing like crazy. And there's so many of them. There's just no putting it back in the bottles. Right? So they're basically they don't have any predators, and they're eating everything in sight. And they're paying people like these guys here to go out and kill as many of them as they can. But for everyone you kill, there's dozens and dozens you don't kill, and so the numbers just keep going up. Another one, I witnessed this one myself, is the zebra mussel. So the zebra mussel is native to Europe. It's a freshwater mollusk, and it came to the American waters, to the Great Lakes, in the ballast water of ships. And we'll talk about ballast water in a little bit, but basically, in order for ships to keep themselves upright when they don't have much cargo in them, they have to bring water on board, and that water often have larval organisms, including, say, mussels. And so it happens. And then what happened was they got into the Great Lakes, and they offloaded some of that water and released these things into the water, and they became an invasive organism. And now they just basically will completely blanket every bit of surface area in a lake. So my mother-in-law and father-in-law had this lake house at Keuka Lake, New York. My wife and I went there on our honeymoon. And then there wasn't a single zebra mussel in there. And there's these flat rocks that line the bottom. You can walk out there barefoot, no problem. And we kept hearing, oh man, the zebra mussels are in this lake, the zebra mussels in that lake. Pretty soon they're going to be out. Like, ooh, now they're in our lake. Within a year or two, you couldn't you would just cut your foot to shreds if you stepped in that lake without shoes on, because every single piece of that, every rock, every piling, every pier, every dock, every boat was just covered with these things. Basically, they don't have any natural predators, and they completely altered the food web there, because they're amazingly efficient filter feeders. So since they're eating most of the planktonic organisms, that impacts the overall food web, and that diminishes the biodiversity of the lake. They also, by the way, they get into things like turbines, boat engines, water intakes for like my father-in-law. He'd get drinking water out of the lake, and it would just get clogged with these things. They're really quite impressive. This one, the cane toad. Okay, so basically, it's a native of South America, Central America. It was brought to, I think it was Jamaica, to eat a particular type of insect that was affecting one particular crop there. Worked great. Did not become invasive. It basically, they introduced it. This exotic species ate the bugs that were a problem. This is before there was pesticides. And so people in Australia said, "Great, mate, we'll try it down here." Right. Well, what happened was they brought it to eat these beetles that were eating their sugarcane. Well, it turns out the sugarcane's tall. The beetles are up here. These frogs, they're the biggest toads in the world. I mean, look at the size of that thing. But they can't climb very well, and so they didn't eat those bugs. They just started eating every other bug. Right. So they basically reproduce like crazy. And you know what? They don't have any natural predators. You know why? They're poisonous. They squirt out this poison in their skin, and anything that eats them will die, right? So basically what's happened is a lot of the predatory species, I'm talking mammals, snakes, birds, are dying because they're trying to eat these things. And these things are out competing like all the other reptiles in the area in terms of food resources. So if you're an insectivore, you can't compete with this guy. And it's just a total mess. And their numbers are continuing to grow. I mean, they're so bad at times people's cars lose traction on the road by running over these things when it's their spawning season. All right, I'll just do one more, because this one I think is just totally amazing. Okay, this is the silver carp. It's also called the Asian carp, although there's lots of different species of Asian carp. This is the silver one that's really the biggest problem, most impressive. So basically, it's a native of Southeast Asia. On East Asia, I think they may have them here in Korea, I'm not sure. But basically, they're brought to the United States back in the 60s, 70s, to help with an aquaculture problem. So remember, aquaculture, one of the problems you have is eutrophication, because you're feeding these fish. You have, right? So you have all these nutrients from their feces. And so algae grows, right? And the oxygen drops. So people say, hey, I know what we'll do. We'll bring these carp. These carp like to eat algae. This is the same kind of fish you see in the Tanshan, right? Why are they there? Eating algae, right? Well, so these fish, they were doing a great job. They worked as advertised, right? They were taking care of the algae problems for these catfish aquaculture operations, which were basically these ponds that were built in the vicinity of the Mississippi River. They bring in Mississippi River water to fill their ponds. All right, anyway. Well, there was a flood that happened. And when the flood happened, the river came up, and it basically topped over these aquaculture farms. And so these fish got loose, right? Turns out Mississippi River is a great place for them to reproduce. And there are selected species, and they grow very rapidly, and they don't have any natural predators. Even people won't eat them. They're disgusting to try to eat. And so they have from the 1970s, so for the last 50 years, they are like the dominant species of fish in the river. They completely altered the ecosystem, completely diminished the biodiversity of the system. And just look at the extent of them. Basically, this is the Mississippi River watershed, and they are all over it, and they're about to get into the Great Lakes. They're trying so hard to keep them out of the Great Lakes. They basically have these canals that they go from the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes, and they set up these electrocution channels to try to shock the fish on. They're going to lose. These fish are going to get there, and these are some important fisheries for the United States. They too are going to get wiped out by this invasive species. And worse yet, weirdly yet, look what they do. They jump out of the water when they hear boats. So people are getting killed because their motorboats are going up the river, and all of a sudden these fish are, like maybe like these 2-3 kilogram fish are jumping out of the water. People's boats, they're hitting, they're breaking people's necks. All right, you should check out a video of it. Just type in Asian carp jumping, and you will not believe. I mean, YouTube has so many videos of this; it's amazing. I think I put one at the end. They're just amazing. Okay, here's one that's particularly problematic. It's the brown tree snake. So the brown tree snake is a native of Indonesia and other like Palau and other places, New Guinea, in sort of the southern Oceania area. Okay, it was actually brought to Guam like in the 1950s in a cargo. Like, so somebody was moving something from Borneo or something like that. They accidentally got it in there. Okay. And then they got loose, and turns out again they don't have any natural predators, and they're great at hunting what's there. Well, Guam is a pretty distant island, so that means, if you recall island biodiversity, there's a lot of endemism there. There's a lot of species that are unique to Guam. Well, because this thing basically ate pretty much. I mean, it led to the extinction of a whole bunch of local bird and lizard populations, right? And some of those birds happen to be pollinators. So these are unique to that island, right? And they were pollinators of some of the trees, which then couldn't reproduce because the bird that helped them reproduce got eaten by these snakes. And to make it worse, these things have a neurotoxin. They're very deadly. They've killed people. They've killed children on Guam. People in Guam are terrified of these things. So it's an absolute case of invasive species causing extinction and all kinds of. It's caused electrical problems because they get fried on the wires. It's just they're amazing. All right, enough about this. So let's just say that let's talk about how they get introduced. Okay, so aquatic ones get introduced through ballast water. So a ship, basically, when it's discharging its cargo, it doesn't want to flip over, so it has to bring in because it'll be top heavy, right? So they bring in water when they're discharging it, so that the ship doesn't flip over, right? Now, what happens is they keep these ballast tanks full when they go to the trip. Now, when they get to where they're going, they push water out, okay, as they're loading new stuff into the boat, and then basically they picked up the animals in one part of the world and they discharge them in another part of the world. That's how the zebra mussels got into my parent-in-law's lake. Now, sometimes it's not uncommon at all for insect species to get into wood if the wood is like a non-treated wood. So wood shipping containers often has bugs in them that can be quite invasive, damaging to whole forest systems. We can just destroy forest systems. That's like the lionfish and the Burmese python. They can be purchased as pets and then released by idiots. And sometimes they're brought in intentionally, like the cane toad, to get rid of one problem. They cause out of the mongoose. Look at this adorable little brown mongoose. He's so cute. Well, these things are vicious killers, and they were brought to Hawaii, I believe it was, to kill rats. But turns out, instead of killing rats, they just kill all these birds, and it was just a disaster. And they're multiplying like crazy. So how do you prevent invasive species? So it turns out a lot of invasive species trace back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, before people really had a handle on this. Now most governments understand what you got to do. Okay, so here's what you do. You need to have thorough inspection of cargo coming into a country. So you'll find that when you try to bring something to a country, it gets inspected. And one of the things they're inspecting for contraband, like drugs or whatever, human trafficking, but they're also looking for invasive species or potentially invasive species. Another thing is most governments now require that the bilge water be cycled out in the open ocean, where it's unlikely that these species that are picked up in a shallow water environment where the ship started will be able to reproduce. And the other one is you have laws that restrict the import of untreated wood. So like furniture made of this or the exotic wood might have bugs in it. So it has to either be fumigated or it can't be brought in. And the other ones you need laws basically making it illegal to have exotic pets because often like the lionfish and like the Burmese python, these get loose and they become problematic. Hey, thanks for watching. Oh, and if you want, at the end of this, you can watch about the Asian carp. I'm not going to play it right now. Okay, I think that's all I got here. Yeah, okay. No, I don't play. Okay, see you guys.